The African Union has urged Kenya and Somalia to engage in dialogue and ensure peace at their border. At least 11 people have been killed on Monday after fighting broke out in Somalia's Jubbaland region bordering Kenya. AU Chairperson Moussa Faki tweeted that peace at the border is important for regional stability. Fighting broke out at Baled-Hawo, a town in the southwestern region of Gedo in Somalia on Sunday night. Somalia has accused Kenya of being behind the attacks. Kenya has, however, denied any involvement in the border clashes and has called for the AU to intervene. Somalia last month severed diplomatic relations with Kenya after accusing Nairobi of blatant interference in Jubbaland affairs. Kenya has denied the accusation. Well, for a closer look at the situation in the Horn of Africa, we're now joined via Skype by Abdullahi Boru Halakhe, who is a political analyst, and he joins us in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter.
So when the diplomatic relations were severed, a lot of people started to think about the tensions that had existed between Kenya and Somalia. Is this escalation something that could have been predicted?
It's certainly yes. The reality is the relationship between Kenya and Somalia has been on this path for some time now, and some of it are things that could have been avoided. But the rhetoric between Kenya and Somalia has only ratcheted up, making things really difficult. The upcoming election scheduled for 8th, that is the Somalia election. With that in mind, it's very easy to see why Somalia's current government would want to externalize some of these things. I just want to also just to point out that there is a maritime dispute between Kenya and Somalia that is going to be, that is International Court of Justice. And the oral proceedings for that is in March. So all these, and if you add to that, there is a scheduled AMISOM, that is African Mission in Somalia, where Kenya has the troops in Somalia also, is scheduled to depart at the end of this year. All this makes it more fraught than it should naturally be.
Who's fighting who in this border region? Because the Kenyans are denying any involvement. The Somalis are adamant that Kenyans are involved. Could there be a third party that's causing the confusion?
10 years old, 2 kids ago, I appreciate
Thank you. Let me just step back a little bit and probably provide the viewers with a more broader, nuanced understanding. Kenya sent its forces into Somalia in 2011, October. And the primary purpose at that time was to contain Al-Shabaab that was, alleged to have been conducting some attacks inside Kenya. However, over the last few years, the Kenyan forces and Kenya's involvement in Somalia has deteriorated into Kenya supporting the Jubbaland region, and the relations between Jubbaland region and the federal government in Mogadishu has completely deteriorated. During the last election in 2019, Kenya was accused of supporting Jubbaland against the federal government in Mogadishu. And so what you're seeing is there is tension inside Somalia, right, between the federal government and Jubbaland, where Kenya now supports Jubbaland. And so that makes it incredibly difficult. Just to bring it up to speed, last year, the Minister for Security for Jubbaland was arrested in Somalia. And then he broke out of jail. He came to Somalia. He came to a region in Kenya called Mandera, and the federal government of Somalia pursued him inside Kenya. And so you have Jubbaland forces and the Somali federal government forces fighting on Kenyan soil. So Kenya's idea of going in to try and contain Al-Shabaab has found itself now increasingly being, locked into the internal conflict inside Somalia, making things a little bit difficult.
All right, so I'll come back to my question again then. Who is fighting who right now? Is Kenya involved in the fighting at the border at this time?
It's very hard to say with a fair degree of certainty to say that Kenyans are the ones who are fighting, because the Kenyan government has not denied the allegations that have been leveled against Kenya, and and that makes it very difficult. You could see why the Somalia government, ahead of the election, would want to say that Kenyans are involved in this, but we do not have an authoritative account that demonstrates without any shadow of doubt that Kenyans are involved. But I won't rule out at this stage that Kenyan forces inside Somalia being involved in this.
What's in it for Kenya with regards to Jubbaland?
That's a very good question. Kenya, when it went in, that is 10 years ago, it really wanted to create a buffer zone between Kenya and Somalia, where Al-Shabaab has set its base from where they were conducting various attacks against Kenya. At that time, it made a great deal of sense. But that problem has metastasized now, and Kenya finding itself in this war between the federal government and the regional government of Somalia. And that is making it very difficult. It's not just making relations between Kenya and Somalia difficult, that is the federal government. It is also making relations between Kenya and Ethiopia fairly fraught now, because the region of Jubbaland is next to Ethiopia. And Ethiopia has been fighting the Ogaden National Liberation Front that is using, that occupies also both the Ethiopian side of the border and the Somalia side of the border in Jubbaland. And so therefore, Ethiopia has gone and supported the federal government, Somalia, against Jubbaland. So last year, but once Jubbaland election became Kenya on one side with Kenya on one side with Jubbaland, and Ethiopia and the federal government on the other hand. So it's such a fairly fluid situation where Kenya would want to use to increase its sphere of influence in Jubbaland, and that is creating tension with the federal government in Somalia, as well as the biggest neighbor in the region, that is Ethiopia.
Who can intervene to assist? It seems as if there are a number of players with different interests. Moussa Faki of the AU Commission is saying that these players must sit down and talk, but one would think that perhaps the African Union itself needs to intervene here.
I think the most credible and obvious player here is the African Union. But with the African Union as well, Peter, it's headquartered in Ethiopia. And if Ethiopia is one of the actors who is potentially involved, it makes it very difficult. Peter, I also just want to highlight that Al-Shabaab would be the biggest beneficiary when the countries that allegedly went into Somalia to contain Al-Shabaab are themselves now locked in a conflict. Al-Shabaab would find it very easy now to continue conducting the attacks that they have conducted inside Somalia and outside Somalia. And that is why Kenya and Somalia diplomatic relation is not just important for both countries, but it's also really important for the region diplomatically. You're talking about, Ethiopia, the biggest player in the region, diplomatic hub of the African continent, and Kenya, a very big player, particularly in trade and economics, and getting increasingly sucked into, the intractable problem, domestic problem of Somalia.
Abdullahi Boru Halakhe, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, but thanks so much indeed for shedding some light on what's something that's very complex and likely going to require skill to try and manage. Thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure, Peter. Have a good one. Thank you.
Okay, that was Abdullahi Boru Halakhe, who's an analyst speaking to us from Washington, D.C. about these tensions on the Somalia-Kenya border. 11 people believed to have been dead, and people blaming each other, countries blaming each other. But as you heard in that conversation, very complex situation, but tensions rising.